Здравствуйте, welcome back to Russian Through Poems and Paintings. Today's day 111, and we're starting now a new chapter with, again, a bit of review today of a very, very difficult topic, one of the hardest in all of Russian grammar, namely motion verbs, right? So we're starting today with what we actually reviewed this fairly recently. If you remember, we talked about how most Russian verbs come in as textual pairs, like читать, прочитать. Then we have what we refer to as unprefixed verbs of motion. And what makes them special and very difficult is that they come in sets of three infinitives. And then we saw how we can add prefixes and get prefixed verbs of motion. And in that case, we're back to the simple system of just two infinitives, right? So we've talked about this last year in book two, and we've, again, reviewed it just very briefly already in this book. So today we're going to take the really tricky part, the unprefixed motion verbs, right? The three infinitives. We're going to review that a little bit before we start now in great detail looking at the meanings of prefixes and how to add them to get new prefixed verbs of motion. And again, the good news is that while that topic is extremely useful, it's actually quite easy. There are really just a couple of little spelling issues to worry about. But again, the best part of it is that when we add prefixes, we're back to the simple, just set of two infinitives. Okay, so I'll try to move through this fairly quickly because we just beat it into the ground in books one and two because it's so difficult, right? So I'll try to pass over this as quickly as I can, and then of course you can review as necessary. Okay, so let's start with the painting Kresny Khod v Kurской губернии by Repin. Just a crowd here in an icon procession, right? Or a Kresny Khod, literally something more like a cross procession, right? And you see Khod. We probably haven't seen that yet, but there's the root for motion by foot all by itself there as a noun, right? Khod. So that Khod root has to do with walking, right? Going by foot. And then we've seen how it's used to create verbs of motion like ходить. And if we were looking at this painting as sort of a snapshot and saying, what are these people doing? We probably wouldn't say ходить, right? Because we don't have any sense that they're walking in circles or meandering, right? They're walking past, or as we'd say using our keyword, they're underway by foot in this kind of parade, right? With the icons. Народ идет по дороге и несет икону. Okay, so here we have not only a verb of motion, идет, and we could unpack that to mean they are underway by foot, but we also have a verb of conveyance, right? They're carrying an icon, here also used in the determinate, right? In its determinate form, and we could say they are underway carrying, right? They're on the march, they're underway, and meanwhile they are carrying, right? Moving and conveying in a determinate manner. Okay, so before we get to the motion verbs themselves, we need to review another kind of tricky topic. That is what prepositions and what cases we use to talk about location, right? And remember, as you know, in Russian, these three categories of где, куда, откуда are all very distinct, and we're going to use different prepositions, different cases to describe each of those, right? Где meaning where are we, location, right? Kuda meaning where to, right? So there the idea is of motion toward or into a location, right? Assuming a location. And atkuda meaning where from, right? So they were leaving a location. Right, so if we look this over, remember that for places, for locations, we have two sets of prepositions, right? One for va nouns and one for na nouns, right? So if you review that quickly, we talked about that a lot, right? Va literally means inside, and we can think of that as the default for most locations, but remember if it's a flat surface or if it's some type of wide open space, then Russian will often use na instead, right? Literally on a surface or on a location, so to speak, right? So we could describe certain nouns as being na nouns. As we know, some of those are obvious, others maybe not so much, right? But in any case, we would learn that these kind of exceptions are na nouns, and that means they take this na set of prepositions, right? So for va nouns, we get va is, right? And then na s, right? So especially pay attention to the atkuda, right? That often confuses people, right? So for example, if it's a na noun, and if we have a na location, then when we leave the location, we're going to get s plus genitive, not is, right? Because we're using that na set of prepositions. Okay, and for people, we have a totally different set of prepositions, right? U, k, and ot, right? Talking basically about visiting people. And, that one kind of tricky thing about that is uh, these prepositions in Russian can express all kinds of things like I'm going to visit someone, I'm going to see someone, I'm going to stay with someone, right? Often people learning Russian will want to say something like that and they'll try to think, oh my God, what's the Russian for staying or visiting, right? And they'll try to pick up some kind of complicated construction with the verb, but keep in mind that in Russian we really, we can really get those ideas across with u, k, od, right? Am I staying with someone or am I visiting them? That's u. Am I on my way to it for a visit? That would be k. And if I'm on my way from a visit, that would be od, right? So we could, of course, combine those with motion verbs and express all kinds of ideas. Okay, so let's review quickly. One more thing, actually, we have three sets of very basic adverbs, right, as well, like здесь, там, дома, right, expressing the idea of being here, coming to here, going from here, right? Again, this где, куда, откуда distinction that's always being made. We'll revisit this topic a little bit later. We're going to learn some more advanced adverbs that also fall into this category. I'm not sure if that's in this book or I think it's in this book, yeah. Okay, so let's just do a few of these. In Russia, okay, we've got to think what kind of space is this? Well, that's v, right? You're in a country. Okay, so that'll be v plus prepositional. We get v России, v России. To Moscow, okay, that's kuda, right? We're going to a location. Moskva, another city, we're going to be using v preposition, so we say v Moskvu, right? Kuda with the accusative. From Petersburg, okay, again, we're using the v prepositions. Here we're going from Petersburg, so we get is Peterburga. Number 4, to the train station. Okay, remember, vokzal, train station, that's a noun, right? And there's a case where it's maybe not completely obvious why that should be the case, but of course, a train station is kind of large and sprawling, so at least it makes some kind of sense. At any rate, vokzal is a noun, so to the train station, that's kuda, and that gives us na vokzal, right? Na vokzal with the accusative. We're going to the station. From the station, okay, that's a noun, so we've got to use s plus the genitive to express откуда, right? Svokzala, svokzala. Okay, two moms, okay, a person, so we're going to, right? That's a kuda expression, k plus dative, k mamie, k mamie. Number 7, at grandma's, okay, that's где, right? We're at grandma's. We're not going to or from there, so we'll say u plus genitive, u babushki, u babushki. Number 8, from my parents. Okay, we've been at their place. We're coming from there. That's going to be от with people, right? От родителей, от родителей. Number 9, to the museum. Okay, that's a v noun, в музей, right? Accusative, в музей, going to the museum. Of course, that could also literally mean into the museum, right? Could mean either. Number 10, at the concert. Okay, that's a huge class of non-nouns. Do you remember what we'd call that? An event, right? So a concert is an event, some type of public gathering. Those are always going to be non-nouns, right? So that's a really useful rule to remember. And here we're at it, right? We're not going to it, we're not coming from it. So that's going to be na plus prepositional, na концерте. Okay, now let's fill in some of these adverbs, right? Very important to know, very commonly used. Here, that's здесь, right? That's the где expression. From here, hence, right? Отсюда, to here, right? Hither, that would be сюда. Okay, from home, that's из дома, and from there, оттуда. Okay, so those you just have to memorize basically, right? But again, note how they fall very neatly into this где, куда, откуда classification. Okay, unprefixed motion verbs. Here are the 5, what I call basic unprefixed verbs of motion, or 5 types of motion, right? Motion by foot, motion by vehicle, going by air, going by water, and running, right? So you could think of those as maybe the five most common, five just very basic types of motion that we learned last year in books 1 and 2, right? So for each of these, if we're talking about the unprefixed verbs, right, the tricky ones, for each type of motion, we're getting three different infinitives, right? So it's a lot to learn here. Now, I'm going to assume that we're pretty familiar with this, right? I don't want to go through and review every last conjugation because we spent so much time on it last year. Let's just quickly review our little keyword system, which we use sort of as a way to introduce what these motion verbs literally mean, right? And I can't stress enough how useful this is, right? If you're having trouble, seeing the distinction between ходить, идти, пойти, if you unpack those verbs, kind of translating them very loosely and inserting the keywords we learned, you'll get a very clear idea of exactly what the Russian is saying. So let's take motion by foot, right? Ходить, the first infinitive, the indeterminate infinitive. We say that means to go by foot around, right? And there's our keyword, right? So to unpack a verb of motion, we want to capture the type of motion right here on foot. And then we want to insert that keyword to nail down whether it's indeterminate or determinate or perfective, right? So ходить means to go around. That can also mean to make round trips. Remember, to make one round trip in the past, for example, or to make multiple round trips, or to be walking around aimlessly. The second one, идти, right, the second infinitive in the set is going to be determinate, and our keyword is underway, right? So we could say on идет, and we could unpack that meaning to mean he is underway by foot, right? He's on his way, meaning he has the sense that he's going somewhere as opposed to just meandering or whatever, or going back and forth. Finally, the third infinitive, remember, is the perfective one, right? Пойти, for example, they're going to begin with по, and that means to set out. That's sort of our keyword. So пойти means to set out or set off or head off on foot, right? So someone is stationary and they're starting a journey, they're setting off. Now remember, one little detail is that if we say things like он пошел в библиотеку, all we know for sure is that he set off for the library, but we often assume that he reached his destination and he completed a one-way trip. But again, to be clear, that's always only an assumption. We never can be sure. Now, by the way, when we first introduced this, you were probably wondering, well, then how on earth do we say clearly that he arrived at the library? Well, we're going to use a prefix verb for that, right? So we even learned it actually, I think, in book 2, при, right? Приходить, прийти, that's a prefixed verb of motion, meaning to arrive on foot, right? So there are actually other ways as well to say that he reached the library. And so we'll get to that very soon. Okay, so I guess maybe the last thing to review quickly, just to be clear, is that with these three infinitives for unprefixed motion verbs, the first two are both imperfective. Let's just recall what that means, right? As with any imperfective verb, it means that they can describe ongoing action or repeated action, right? So for example, ходить can mean something's ongoing, like he's walking around the room or he was walking around the room. Or, for example, he goes to class every day, repeated round trips, or he used to go to class every day, right? So it can be ongoing or repetition. Same thing with et, right? Et is also imperfective. So it can mean to be underway, right? In the sense of an ongoing one-way trip that's still unfolding, or it can also describe repeated one-way trips, right? Every day at 8 o'clock, I'm on my way to class, that kind of idea. So one quick warning that sometimes this idea crops up, right? People start thinking that ходить is more imperfective than et. That's a very common misconception that is often encouraged by sloppy treatments of these motion verbs, right? So that's just simply categorically not the case, right? Both ходить and et are both by definition imperfective, right? So they are both 100% totally, utterly imperfective, and there's no question of degree, right? Again, the distinction between them is simply indeterminate versus determinate, going around versus being underway. That's the difference. Okay, so let's play this unpacking game. And by the way, at this stage especially, we've been over this so often that at this point it would be great not to unpack the verbs actually. unless you're kind of confused and you want to be really sure, right? It's much better to visualize what's happening. That's what ideally we should be doing in language, right? Not translating back and forth, but really visualizing kind of immediately what kind of picture the verb or the phrase or whatever is painting in the mind of a native speaker, right? So we can also use the little pictograms, right? Or just kind of use that as a tool for visualizing, right? Chadit is like this, right? Et is kind of an arrow, right? A line of some kind with an arrow to get that sense of kind of advancement or determinacy. And paiti, we could draw. I like to draw a little vertical line to show someone still, and then off they go, right? To kind of suggest the start of motion. Okay, so let's see. Samaliot litit. Okay, you may need to refer to the table and review these conjugations. They're not easy, but we have to assume that you are reasonably familiar with them. Okay, so litit, that's from litiet, right? That's from the determinate verb. So we could say the plane is underway by air, right? Now, again, remember that if you simply translate these, the plane is flying. I guess that's fine as a translation, but it isn't really telling you what the Russian's telling you, right? Because again, English verbs of motion tend to be more vague than the Russian. So if we really want to get across what we're seeing here, it would be the plane is on its way through the air. Now compare that to number 2, samolot letayet, that's indeterminate. We could say the plane is flying around by air. It's moving around by air. Okay, so think you look up in the sky and you see some kind of little tiny plane or stunt plane or whatever it could be that's kind of flying around, doing loops, flying in circles, whatever it may be. That would be litats, right? But if you see like a jet airplane that's flying past, it's clearly on its way somewhere and it's flying across the sky, for example, then we would use litit, right? Litiet, right? To be underway. Okay, number 3. Мы будем ехать 2 часа. We will be underway by vehicle for 2 hours, right? Now think, that's kind of awkward, right? We've unpacked it and we've captured the meaning very precisely. And think about ways you might translate that more loosely, like we'll be on the road for 2 hours, right? Or our trip will take 2 hours. That's the simplest way in Russian to say all of those things. Number 4, мы поедем туда завтра. We will set out by vehicle to there tomorrow, right? So we're going to set off on a trip to wherever this is by vehicle, right? So this is clearly a journey. It's not simply going to the theater or something in town. It's a journey, and that implies motion by vehicle. Number 5, собака бегала, past tense. Okay, that's бегать, that's indeterminate, so the dog was running around. Compare that to number 6, собака бежала, that бежать is determinate, so we could say the dog was underway running, meaning it was clearly on its way somewhere. Maybe it was chasing something, right? Who knows? Okay, number 7, now again, we compare the third possibility, собака побежала. That means the dog was sitting or whatever, and off it ran, right? It ran off. Okay, so look at those 3. That's in some ways the best way to really think about these verbs of motion is to compare all 3 possibilities, right? Running around, being underway by running, and running off, right? So these 3 sentences really conjure up a very different image for the listener. Number 8, он ходил по комнате. He was walking around the room. He was going around on foot in the room, right? So he could be literally walking in circles or pacing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Okay, let's just look at these sentences and let's basically just choose an infinitive. And then we might translate as well, but the main point here is just make sure we're choosing the right verb, right? The right verb of motion. I'm going to a lecture. Okay, it sounds like someone is on their way to a lecture. That's going to be идти, right? Going by foot, we assume this is an in-town trip. Again, we assume, right? Я иду на лекцию. Я иду на лекцию. Иду. From идти. Number 2, I go to lectures every day. Okay, that's repeated round trips, right? So we would probably use ходить here. Я хожу на лекции каждый день, right? Number 3, I'll go to a lecture tomorrow too. Okay, that's a one-time future trip. We're going to review that in just a moment, but remember for one-time future trips, we have no choice in Russian but to use по, right? Perfective verb. So this will be я пойду на лекцию завтра. Тоже, right? Я тоже пойду на лекцию завтра. Okay, number 4, she went home, she's home now. Okay, this is getting across the idea that she hasn't come back, right? She hasn't made a round trip, but she's gone home, right? She's completed a one-way trip and she remained there. So that'll be пойти. Right now, again, we assume that we're talking about in-town outings, right? Unless we see some clue otherwise, right? So here we're just kind of assuming that this is talking about she went home, not that she's traveling to another city or something like that. Она пошла домой, теперь она дома, right? Она пошла домой. Now, if she was in Russia and then she traveled home back to the US or whatever, then of course we'd say она поехала домой. Okay, number 5, she was flying to Russia. Okay, basically she was on her way to Russia on a plane. Past tense, она летела в Россию. Number 6, we know how to swim. Okay, that's the activity generally. That's going to be indeterminate, right? Мы умеем плавать. Мы умеем плавать. Number 7, we want to finally go to Russia. Okay, you want to go to Russia? It's pretty clear this is a one-time trip, right? We want to finally take a trip to Russia. It's in the future. We have no choice but to use поехать, right? Мы хотим, наконец, поехать в Россию. Right? Мы хотим поехать в Россию. Okay, number 8, we went to Petersburg last year. Okay, that's a completed journey. Of course, it's by vehicle. Right, a completed round trip. Мы ездили в Петербург в прошлом году. Okay, number 9, we'll go to Russia every summer. That's repeated round trips in the future. So again, also by vehicle, right? It's a journey. Мы будем ездить в Россию каждое лето. Мы будем ездить. Now remember when we use an indeterminate verb in the future, like будем ходить, будем ездить, that automatically means repeated round trips in the future, right? So it's different from in the past. We're going to look at that in just a moment as well. I'll review it. Okay, number 10, we'll travel around Russia. Okay, sounds like indeterminate motion by vehicle. Мы будем ездить по России, right? По plus the dative. Number 11, I like to run in the park. Okay, sounds like just the activity itself in a general sense. Я люблю бегать в парке, right? Я люблю бегать в парке. Number 12, we're sailing to Helsinki. Okay, it sounds like a one-way trip. We're on our way by boat to Helsinki. Мы плывем в Helsinki. Okay, let's quickly review the breakdowns. Again, I'm going to do this pretty quickly because I know you're sick of it probably, right? But remember that we like to think of motion verbs, these unprefixed motion verbs, as being kind of a system. They're quite systematic. We've seen that. So we should keep that in mind, but we should also keep in mind these 5 special situations that, something happens here that we might not expect based on our overall knowledge of how the system works. So we say that the system is breaking down maybe just a little bit, and so we want to pay special attention to these specific situations. Let's look at a painting quickly. Катание на Неве, right? Катание, that's a verbal noun from a motion verb we haven't learned yet, but we're going to learn it in this chapter actually. It means катать, it's кататься, which means basically to roll around literally or to go for a ride, right? Когда-то было так холодно зимой, что можно было ходить и даже ездить по Неве. Right? It used to be so cold that you could walk around or even drive a carriage, right? Ride on a horse, right? You could ride around on the frozen Neva. I'm not sure that's always the case anymore. It hasn't been it hasn't been as cold in Russia recently in winter as it used to be, and a lot of Russians are complaining about it. Anyway, there's global warming for you. Okay. So breakdown number 1. This is pretty simple for vehicles, especially large vehicles like buses, trains. Russians tend to use motion by foot verbs for those, right? So for example, Смотри, наш автобус идет. Right, our bus is on its way. Here it comes. Right, we're using the motion by foot verb. Поезд идет на восток, meaning it's on its way to the east. But, by the way, kind of a breakdown of a breakdown, right? If it's a little passenger vehicle, then you would normally hear ехать, right? So, for example, машина ехала очень быстро. Okay, so again, we're using motion by foot verbs for large forms of public transportation. By the way, people often ask about planes. Well, planes fly usually, right? So, of course, if you were in an airplane, or a helicopter or whatever, you would use a flying verb. Okay, number 2, in-town outings. This is a really important one. If you're talking about what you're doing in town, right, like I'm going to class, to a performance, to the movies, to a restaurant, whatever it may be, you're going to use motion by foot verbs by default, unless you're talking specifically about what vehicle you're taking to get there. Right, so it's kind of like in English, the difference between saying I'm going to the movies versus I'm driving to the movies, right? You would only say driving if that were sort of the point of the sentence, right? How are you getting to the movies versus this neutral fact of I'm going to the movies, right? So for in-town outings, use motion by foot. Now, again, if it's clear that you're leaving town, right, you're going on a journey from one town to another or to another country where a vehicle is obviously involved in any case, then you would use a motion by vehicle verb. So, for example, вчера мы ходили в Эрмитаж. Yesterday we made a round trip to the Hermitage. Now, look, again, we're using ходить, we're using a motion by foot verb. Does that literally mean that they went there on foot? No. Again, it just simply means they went to the Hermitage, and chances are very good actually that they took a bus or a subway or something, right? But again, that's not really the point of this statement. Now compare that to мы ездили в Эрмитаж на метро, right? So here you're specifying на метро. So in that case, you're specifying the vehicle. You need a motion by vehicle verb. Now again, you could have just simply said мы ездили в Эрмитаж, that all by itself, and that would mean that we took transportation to get to the Hermitage. Okay, мы едем в Москву или на дачу, right? We're underway by vehicle to Moscow or to the dacha, which is outside of town, right? So these are instances where you're clearly going to another city, and so you need a motion by vehicle verb, right? Assuming, of course, that you're not going there on foot, right? But that's not very likely. Okay, breakdown number 3, future round trips. Okay, we mentioned a moment ago that if you use an indeterminate verb in the future, that automatically implies multiple round trips, right? So if you say use ходить in the future, that means you're going to make multiple trips on foot. Whereas if you say, if you use ходил in the past, that could mean you completed one round trip or you made multiple round trips, right? It would depend on context to know which is which. So for example, мы будем ездить в Россию, that automatically means we will make multiple trips to Russia. Okay, that cannot possibly mean we'll go to Russia once, right? Now remember, if you want to make one trip to Russia, you're going to have to use поехать, right, for one future trip. So let's actually review all 3 possibilities for future tense, right, in these 3 examples. Again, мы будем ездить в Россию, that automatically means we'll make multiple journeys to Russia, multiple round trips. If you say мы будем ехать в Россию, that usually means we will be on our way to Russia, right? Meaning, like, I don't know when you would say that, right? Like tomorrow, what will you be up to? Well, I'll be en route to Russia, right? I'll be on my way to Russia, right? Мы будем ехать. And finally, мы поедем в Россию, that's your single future trip, right? We will make one trip by vehicle to Russia, right? Okay. Number 4, strongly implied round trips. This is kind of a tricky one. The good news here is that it's kind of hard to make a mistake. The issue basically is that if you say, for example, every morning I go to class, right? Well, if we take that kind of literally, then we're going to see a picture of someone making multiple one-way trips, right? Every morning I get up and I go to class, right? Repeated one-way trips. But because obviously, if we take sort of the big picture view of this, then the person's not only going to class every day, but he or she is coming home again, right? So we kind of zoom out from the sort of the literal kind of narrow description to kind of the big picture, and we get strongly implied round trips. So in situations like that, even where a determinate verb, right, repeated one-way motion may be more accurate, Russians tend to kind of uh, use the round trip verbs, right, the indeterminate verbs. So for example, каждый июнь я еду в Россию. Okay, I head off, I go to Russia every June, right? Uh, let's say for the sake of argument that you come back in August, right? So again, what you do in June is you're repeating a one-way journey, right? Uh, but again, assuming you come back again every year, then you're more likely to hear in Russian, каждый июнь я езжу в Россию, right? That's just a strong tendency. Or for example, я иду домой с работы в 6. Okay, in this instance, we have a repeating final leg, right? This is the end of your day. You can do any number of things during the day as part of your schedule, but that final leg, right, you can see logically that can only be one thing. You're going home and you're staying there, right? You're not making a round trip home and then leaving, right? This is at the very end of the day, right? So this is kind of again, it's kind of a breakdown of a breakdown, right? You see how complicated this gets, right? It's that repeating final leg that you would have to use a determinate verb for. Okay, finally, an easy one. The near future. This is a lot like in English, right? If you say, we say things like "I'm going to the theater tonight," even though literally that's future tense, right? But we often don't say "I will go to the theater," but rather "I'm going." Same thing in Russian. So we can say "Мы завтра едем в Helsinki." We are underway to Helsinki tomorrow, literally, right? So again, we're using present tense when what we literally mean is future. Мы сегодня вечером идем в театр, right? Again, present tense. Or finally, мы летим домой послезавтра. Okay, let's pick a few more examples, pick some correct verbs, and here we're watching out for breakdowns. Do trains go to that city? Okay, meaning do they circulate there? Do they make regular trips there? Okay, yes, they do. Let's assume, and well, anyway, we're asking the question here. I guess we don't have to assume anything. But what's the trick here? We're talking about trains, so we're going to use motion by foot verbs, right? Ходить. So поезда ходят в этот город, right? Поезда ходят. Okay, number two. So by the way, question number one, that's breakdown number one. Number two, we're going to a ballet tonight. Okay, that's breakdown number five, right? That's near future. So you could say мы пойдем на балет сегодня вечером, but more likely is simply мы идем на балет, right? Present tense. Number three, we took a taxi to the ballet yesterday. Okay, again, this isn't just a neutral, мы ходили на балет, right? But rather we took a vehicle there. And what's more, here we specify the vehicle, so we have no choice but to use a motion by vehicle verb. Мы ездили на такси на балет, right? Мы ездили туда на такси. Number four, we're going to the dacha. Okay, remember dacha by definition is outside the city. So again, unless you're literally walking there, you need to choose a motion by vehicle verb. Мы едем на дачу. Мы едем на дачу. We're underway by vehicle. Number five, the train was going very slowly. That's breakdown number one again. Поезд шел очень медленно, right? It was underway very slowly. Okay, number six, I want to go to Moscow next month. That's a one-time future trip, so we're going to have to use поехать, right? Я хочу поехать в Москву. Я хочу поехать в Москву в следующем месяце, right? Now again, if we say here, я хочу ездить в Москву, that would mean, again, automatically multiple round trips. So of course, if that were actually the case, then of course you could say that, but most of us don't make multiple trips to Moscow in 1 month, probably. Okay, number seven, I go to class every morning. Okay, that's breakdown number four, right? So if we're being very literal about it, we would say каждое утро я иду на занятия. Потом, number eight, я иду в библиотеку. And number nine, и вечером я иду домой. Right? Those are describing repeated one-way trips. Now, again, the tendency in Russian is, again, breakdown number four, The first two are strongly implied round trips, right? Every day you go to class and then you leave class, right? Then you go to the library, then you leave the library. So we could say for number 7, я хожу на занятия каждое утро. Number 8, я хожу в библиотеку. And number 9, now here's the exception to the exception, right? Каждый вечер я иду домой. That's the recurring final leg of your daily routine, so we've got to use a determinate verb there. Okay, now remember the good news for 7 and 8 is that either of those are possible. There's a slight difference in emphasis, but they essentially boil down to the same thing. So for breakdown number 4, it's maybe not that big of a deal because it you can't really make a mistake with it. Okay, number 10, I'll take a trip to Russia next year. Okay, sounds like a one-time trip, we assume. Я поеду в Россию в следующем году. Right? Я поеду в Россию. Okay, number 11, I'll be going to Russia regularly. Okay, again, that's future round trips. We need here, я буду ездить в Россию часто, регулярно, right? However you want to put it. Okay, so again, multiple round trips. Я буду ездить. Number 12, he drives to work each morning. Okay, that's back to breakdown number 4, right? Каждое утро он едет на работу. But because we assume he comes home again every day, there would be a strong tendency to say он ездит на работу. Он ездит на работу. Okay, let's look at finally conveyance verbs. So let's just review these quickly. Again, I don't want to read through all of them. Hopefully you know them fairly well. Remember that the determinate forms like нести, вести, вести, and then also we add por, then we get the perfectives, понести, повести, повести. Those are a little bit tricky. Those are those obstruents, right? So remember that they're also irregular in the past, right? So we get, for example, нес, несла, несло, несли, and so forth. So those are tricky verbs. You want to be sure you review those because when we start adding prefixes to these verbs of conveyance, we're going to get, again, the same verb type. Again, it's going to be these obstruents, irregular in the past. So these 3 verbs are extremely common in Russian, as you can imagine, and they're going to be even more common for us once we start creating prefixed forms, right? So be sure to review the conjugations as needed. Okay, so to quickly review these, right, we've got 3 basic types of conveyance. Conveyance by foot. So you're carrying something on foot, and you can also be on foot and be leading someone. So I like to think of that literally as like leading a horse by the bridle or leading someone by the hand, right? But this would also be used for taking people somewhere, assuming you're not literally carrying them or something, right? Or taking them by vehicle, right? This is just taking them. So if you say things like, I took my friend to a party or to a restaurant, you would use this a leading verb, right? Now, of course, if you took them by vehicle, you would use the taking by vehicle verb, right? So the third and final verb, starting with возить, that can be used for taking anything by vehicle. Okay, so look at how we can imagine these verbs, these actions, as lining up with motion verbs, right? Мы ходили по городу, мы шли на вокзал, мы пошли на вокзал. Okay, so those are the 3 different verbs for motion by foot. And what if we were doing those 3 things while carrying suitcases? Well, we would just substitute a carrying verb, a verb of conveyance, in place of the verb of motion, and you can see how they line up perfectly in terms of their meaning, right? Мы носили чемоданы. We were walking around the city, and we were carrying suitcases around. Мы шли на вокзал, мы несли чемоданы. We were on our way by foot to the station. We were on our way carrying suitcases. Мы пошли на вокзал means we set off on foot for the station. Мы понесли чемоданы means we set off carrying suitcases. Right, so imagine there the suitcases are on the ground or whatever, they're stationary, you're stationary, you pick them up and off you go, right? That's the right setting off type of motion verb. Okay, so let's pick a few of these and do some simple sentences. Where are you taking that wine? Okay, let's assume, again, sometimes we have to kind of make some assumptions here that they're carrying it, right? Hey, where are you carrying that wine to? Okay, that sounds like they're underway and we're stopping them and asking them, right? Where are you taking the wine? That'll be нести, right? Куда ты несешь это вино? Куда ты несешь? Where are you underway to carrying the wine, maybe? Number two, he carries books everywhere with him. Okay, sounds like multiple direction, indeterminate. Он носит книги везде с собой, right? Literally with himself, с собой. Он носит книги везде с собой. Number three, I'm bringing souvenirs from Russia. Okay, now we're coming from Russia. That means we're taking a vehicle. So we need, in this case, a taking by vehicle verb, right? And we'd say here, if right, we're on our way with souvenirs, we'd say, Я везу сувениры из России. Я везу, right? Now, by the way, we'll learn soon that we could use a prefix verb, привозить, привезти. That would be a little bit more specific here, maybe a little bit better, but we'll get to that very soon. Okay, number four, I took a guest to the museum. Okay, assuming you didn't carry him or her or drive them, right? We're going to use водить, right, to lead. And this is a completed round trip in the past, so we are going to use водить. Я водил гостя в музей. Number five, here, let me take that suitcase. Okay, that's going to be a davai suggestion, right? We reviewed those not long ago on day 110, I think, right? Now, again, let's imagine they're standing there holding a suitcase, or they could even be carrying the suitcase, right? And the idea is, hey, give me that, and I'll set off with it, right? I'll, so to speak, start carrying it, right? That would be the most likely thing to say. Давай я понесу. Давай я понесу чемодан. Number six, where are you taking us? Okay, let's assume we're being led somewhere, right? We're not being carried or driven, right? We would say, куда ты нас ведешь? Куда ты нас ведешь? Now contrast that with number seven, where we're clearly talking about driving. That would be, куда ты нас везешь? Right, in both cases, we're underway, we're on our way somewhere, and we want to know where are we going. Okay, number eight, this train hauls oil. Okay, that seems like kind of a general statement, and so it hauls oil in all sorts of directions, back and forth or whatever. Okay, now again, even if we assume it's hauling it only in one direction, we're still getting this implied round trip. Okay, so we could think of this in terms of breakdown number four. In any case, we probably say этот поезд возит нефть, возит, right? Okay, right, because it is a vehicle and it's taking it by vehicle. Okay, so right, it's conveying the oil. Number nine, where did he carry the beer to? Okay, sounds like someone's run off with our beer, right? Let's assume that at least. Куда он понес пиво? Куда он понес пиво? Right? Where did he run off to with the beer? Okay. Now again, there are other ways to say that. We're going to learn. We could use prefix forms there as well, right? Like someone ran off with the beer. There is another way to say that. We're going to learn it soon. Okay, number 10. Who's leading the negotiations? Okay, this is a common kind of figurative use of the verb vesti, right? To lead in kind of a more figurative sense where you're conducting something or you're in charge of something. That's a fairly common use of the verb vesti. Now note that if you're leading negotiations, then that suggests not leading them in a kind of meandering, aimless fashion, but hopefully, guiding them towards their conclusion or something, right? You're doing it in a purposeful and, so to speak, determinate manner. And so you would only use vesti for that type of figurative meaning, right? Кто ведет переговоры? Кто ведет переговоры? Okay, so that's it for today. That's, again, a lot of grammar packed in there, but we went through it fairly quickly because we spent so much time on it earlier. But that's a pretty detailed review of the topic. I sometimes like to, again, kind of emphasize that we're not really leaving any stone unturned here with that coverage of unprefixed verbs of motion, right? It pretty much accounts for any situation you can encounter. Again, if I'm missing something, it'll come as news to me, right? I don't think it's very likely, at least not anything really important. There are a couple of other little details but it's covered elsewhere in the book. For example, how to use motion verbs and imperatives, uh, certain instances when you're using negation, but it's covered elsewhere, and we don't need to review every last nook and cranny. But basically, the point is that if you've gone through the books up to this point, you know pretty much everything there is to be said about unprefixed verbs of motion. That's a huge accomplishment. Um, the only thing you don't know about unprefixed verbs of motion is the remaining unprefixed verbs of motion, right? So we're going to cover that here in a couple of lessons. Things like dragging, chasing, tumbling, right? So things you wouldn't use very often, maybe, but they're going to work exactly like the verbs we've just reviewed today. And anyway, tomorrow we're going to start finally looking at prefixation in detail, and that's going to be a really useful topic, and thankfully a fairly simple one. Okay, so until then, до свидания.